Okay, so we'll move on to talking about self-esteem now. Dr. Michael Edelstein is a clinical psychologist. He lives in San Francisco and is the author of 3-Minute Therapy. I know a lot of people here have read the book. Michael suggests, and this is something would be interesting to those who have followed Nathaniel Branden, Michael suggests not becoming a slave of the concept of self-esteem. He thinks that low self-esteem is a problem, but he thinks, if I'm correct in understanding from what I have read up from him, that the problem is in the duality between positive self-esteem and negative self-esteem. Michael Edelstein's belief that it's best to ignore the concept altogether. There are many people who think that higher self-esteem encourages people to do better and makes them happier, but Dr. Edelstein says that in a test, in a psychological test, American kids believed that they were among the best in an international sample in math skills, whereas in the actual test, they were the worst. He believes that social pursuit of high self-esteem might do considerable harm by removing reasons for self-reflection, but I'll let Michael come and talk with us about it more. Dr.
Thank you. I have a somewhat different approach to the border police than does Doug. My approach is when they talk to me, actually when they look at me, to disengage as soon as possible. So when I arrived at the airport last night and they asked me, why am I coming into Canada? I said, to visit a friend. And that ended the discussion. I was very happy about that. I want to give you a little background how I became a libertarian, and it wasn't through Ron Paul, it was through Walter Block. The way I met Walter Block is we were living in Brooklyn and we were both devotees of a particular form of psychotherapy called Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, REBT for short, and this approach was devised by a genius in the 20th century in the psychology and psychotherapy movement named Albert Ellis. Anyone here heard of Albert Ellis? Oh, great. Anyone read books by Albert Ellis? Oh, fantastic. That's great. I didn't know people interested in economics had such broad interests also. So I'll be discussing the theories of Albert Ellis. Walter and I were both in therapy with Albert Ellis, and Walter was there for public speaking anxiety, and I was there for extreme neuroticism. For example, I had a morbid fear of Mongolian sheep. Obviously, Walter was cured, as you saw a few minutes ago. I got worse. And I was a liberal Democrat when I met Walter, and he converted me to the gospel according to Sage Rothbard, for which I'm very thankful. Now, in psychology and psychotherapy, we start and end with emotions. And in order to attain emotional inner freedom, it means overcoming the types of emotions that restrict us, suppress us, and add unhappiness to our lives. Emotions such as anxiety, depression, anger, guilt, resentment, envy, jealousy, hurt, a whole host of these emotions that humans are heir to. Also, destructive behaviors such as addictions and procrastination. Anyone here not experience on any kind of regular basis anxiety, depression, anger, guilt, procrastination, or addictions? It looks like we have one Martian in the crowd. But as you can see, this is the human condition. In the style of Henry Hazlitt, what I'd like to do is give you the lesson and then explain how it applies to these different problems. The lesson is very simple but has profound ramifications, sort of like the non-aggression principle. The simple lesson is abolish all must, should, supposed to's, have to's, demands from the way we look at life while reinforcing our goals and values and our preferences. That's the lesson. Now, to be a little more specific, we usually have a preference to do well and get approval, and that could be expressed as, I strongly prefer to do well and get approval, and if I succeed, I have advantages in my life, and if I fail, I have disadvantages. But then, being imperfect humans, we often escalate these preferences into demands. Because I prefer to do well and get approval, therefore I absolutely must, I have to, I've got to do well and get approval, and if I don't, this proves I'm no good. The second of the three core demands is in terms of how others treat us, and it takes the form of, I prefer others treat us well, fairly, kindly, considerately, lovingly, and if they don't, that's too bad, that's disadvantageous, but because I run the universe, they absolutely must, they have to treat me well, and if they don't, they're devils and demons and deserve to roast in hell, and I've appointed myself their roaster. That leads to resentment, anger, and hostility. The third demand is an impersonal demand, a demand on the conditions of one's life, which leads to procrastination and addictions. And this starts as a reasonable preference. I prefer life be fair, easy, and hassle-free. And if it's not, that's too bad. I'll try to improve my situation. But it absolutely must treat me well. Life must be fair, rational, and libertarian. And if it's not, that's horrible, terrible, and awful, and I have to be miserable forever. And then I escape through addictions or procrastinate. Now, I want to say a word about how words such as must and should are used within this context. And that is, different bodies of knowledge have different definitions for different words. For example, the word apple in the food industry has one meaning. If you take a bite out of an apple, it's nutritious and healthy. And in the computer world, the same word, apple, has a totally different meaning. So if you take a bite out of your Apple computer, it doesn't taste that good, and you might even break a tooth. Similar with depression. Depression in Austrian business cycle has one meaning, and in psychopathology has an entirely different meaning. So within the context we're discussing, a must and a should, an absolutistic must and a should, doesn't simply mean a must of prediction. If I want to get to the conference by 8, I must get up by 7. That's not an issue. But it's an absolutistic must. I must do well, you must treat me well, life must go well, and if it's not, it's awful. So this kind of must, what we call a psychopathological must, leads to global conclusions. I'm no good, you're no good, life is no good, it's awful, I can't stand it, I'll be miserable forever, and leads to anxiety, depression, anger, procrastination, and addictions. So that's one of the main ways to differentiate it. So with my clients, when they have these problems, I help them identify their must, what they're telling themselves in their head, what their basic philosophy is that are causing these emotional problems, and then I show them how to overcome that. So let me give you some examples. I commonly work with people with alcohol addictions. They drink too much, they have DUIs, driving under the influence. They've had problems with their partner. They miss work. They make themselves unhealthy. So the drinking for them is an issue. And the reason they have this problem is very simple. It doesn't go back to their childhood or their dysfunctional family or a disease or even genetic predispositions. These are all influences, but it goes back to what they're telling themselves. It's the ideas in their head that are causing their addictions. And this is good news because this means they're powerful over their addictions rather than powerless, because it's a matter of changing their thinking. So they often think, because I have a craving, because I have an urge for a drink, I absolutely must, I have to drink right now, and I can't stand it if I don't, even though this drinking has led me to a host of problems in my life. Now, the solution to that is to question, challenge, and contradict your musts and shoulds, to see that there's no evidence for musts and shoulds, psychopathological musts and shoulds, the way we're defining them, but there is evidence for preferences. So they can remind themselves that although I prefer to satisfy my urge, I don't absolutely have to. It would be uncomfortable not to drink right now, but I definitely can bear discomfort. I've had these urges before, these cravings before, and I've survived, and I'll survive them in the future. I can still have a happy life if I don't drink, if I don't give in to my desire, although I might be happier for the moment if I do. Another very common problem is depression. So something goes poorly in your life, you're fired from your job, and you get depressed, hopeless, put yourself down, have low self-esteem. But again, although intuitively most people would say it's losing your job that made you depressed, we know differently. It's not losing your job. Situations don't have that power over us. It's our ideology, what we tell ourselves about those situations, that cause our emotions. So in this case, the person is often telling themselves, although I prefer not to lose my job, I absolutely must not. I have to have a job, otherwise I'm no good, I'm a worthless failure, and life is awful. So again, the solution is to look for evidence for that belief. All humans are little scientists. We do what we think we have evidence will make us better off, and we avoid doing what we think we have evidence won't make us better off, and that's how we come to our beliefs also. So if you ask yourself, what's the evidence I absolutely must keep my job, that I'm no good, I'm a worthless loser because I'm fired, then normally there's no evidence. In fact, the underlying lesson here is there's no evidence for these psychopathological musts and shoulds. They're fictions. They're like Santa Claus. They don't exist. And musts and shoulds, in some ways, are analogous to the state. Most people believe the state is helpful. They need the state to have a good life. And most people cling to their musts and shoulds because they believe that helps them, that motivates them, and that makes their life better. But the truth with the state and with our demands is the exact opposite. They tend to lead to feeling worse and being worse off, to self-destructive emotions and behaviors. A final example is in terms of anger. A common situation is you're cut off in traffic and you get angry at the person who endangered your life. Why did you get angry? Again, most people would say because of that crazy driver in front of me, but we know different. By the way, in terms of our thinking causing our emotions, rather than situations, I've been trying to guess what is the greatest myth people have and have had across all cultures and all societies. And one would be a belief in the state, that the state is here to help you, that we need the state, that the state is a good thing. But I think the greatest myth that is unquestioned, except in small areas of philosophy like Stoicism and rational behavior therapy, a greater myth than believing in the state is believing our situations cause our emotions. You made me angry, or I'm stressed about my deadlines, or I'm jealous because my husband had an affair. All these indicate that people think that our situations cause our emotions. And 99 out of 100 people or more would agree with that. But that's a fiction. That's not the way we work. The way we work is our thinking. Look at your thinking. Identify your thinking if you don't like your disturbed emotions. That's the lesson. So with our angry driver, again, his thinking is in terms of demands. That crazy driver shouldn't have cut me off. He deserves to be punished. So I'll honk and honk and honk at him to punish him. And again, there's no evidence for the must. If you open your eyes when you drive on the road, you'll see that there are many crazy drivers on the road. In fact, I'm one of the few good drivers on the road. And that's the reality. So the solution is to accept, not like or enjoy reality, but accept the fact, tolerate the fact that this is reality, this is the way things are, and by eating myself up inside, that will not help. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of psychotherapies and authors in psychotherapy who have very good advice and insights don't help people is because there's one thing missing, and which has been missing from my talk so far, and that is, how do you get from level 1 to level 2 thinking? Level 1 thinking is a superficial recognition that there are no musts and shoulds, that there's no reason why I must not get fired, I'm not a special person, I'm not God's gift to the human race, so I'm heir to being fired as anyone else. There's no reason that there shouldn't be crazy drivers on the road because they're all around us. So that's a superficial recognition of the reality. That's level 1, which most of us have. But level 2 is a deep appreciation of this, a deep understanding, feeling, and acting on this insight, not just being able to parrot it. It's inculcating it in our brain. So the question is, how do we get from level 1 to level 2? From seeing that this is the way the state acts, Thomas Jefferson said it's a natural order of things for governments to gain and liberty to yield. So we have a recognition of what the reality is. How do we get it into our heads that this is the way it is, it's always been this way, the state always will be that way, so we don't upset ourselves when we see the state getting more and more vicious and more oppressive. And the answer is the bridge from getting from level 1 to level 2 is the learning process. The way we learn is through practice, repetition, reinforcement, going over something again and again and again. The more you read Rothbard, the deeper your level of understanding is through reinforcement, thinking about it, and going over it, and then practicing it. So it's the same with thinking in terms of preferences rather than musts and shoulds. The more we practice and reinforce the idea that there's no reason why things absolutely must be the way we want them to be. It would be lovely, it would be desirable, it's very disadvantageous, profoundly bad when things go poorly, but there's no reason they must not. The more we reinforce that idea, the more we start to think differently and thereby feel and think differently. So that's the basic lesson. Eliminate your musts and shoulds. It's deceptively simple, but it takes more practice and more schooling to apply. Is there anyone, and you've admitted by not raising your hands, except for that one Martian over there, that you sometimes do feel angry, anxious, depressed, act addictively, and procrastinate? Is there anyone who doesn't see how this model applies to you? Who doesn't see what your must or should is, what you're demanding, and how you can free yourself from it? Everyone's cured. Yes?
I would really like you to elaborate on procrastination.
Sure. Elaborate on procrastination.
Now or later?
There's a group, there's a 12-step group called Procrastinators Anonymous. They were formed 15 years ago. They've never met.
We're going to do it next month.
So with procrastination, let's suppose it's time to wash the dishes, and I say to myself, well, it'll be a pain in the neck to wash the dishes right now. I'd rather continue doing my email. I prefer not to do it. I'll do it later. Well, that makes sense. There's no reason why you have to like washing dishes. You prefer not to wash them. But then you can weigh your preference to avoid discomfort now with your greater preference to have more comfort in the long run. And normally if you get the dishes over with and they're not hanging over your head, then the greater preference makes more sense. So you weigh the preferences and act on your greater preference and get the dishes done. But being imperfect humans, we escalate our immediate preference. I prefer not to have the hassle of washing the dishes. Therefore, I must avoid it. I can't stand it. I have to do what I feel like doing right now, which is my email. So I'll wash the dishes in an hour, and an hour, and an hour, and an hour. So that's a model for procrastination. Now, sometimes people have a different must, not the third must. Life must be comfortable and easy, but the first must, the demand on oneself. I must do it perfectly, and if I can't do it perfectly, I can't do it at all. So it's time to start writing that great book on anarchy without bombs. You got a great title, but it's difficult, it's uncomfortable to sit down to write the book. So again, you say, because I prefer not to face the discomfort, I absolutely must, so I'll start tomorrow. So the solution, again, is to question, challenge, and contradict the must. Why must I feel comfortable right now? Why should it be easy and spontaneous to write a book? Why must I do it perfectly? Will waiting really help me in that cause? And the answer to those questions is obviously no. I don't have to feel comfortable. Writing a book often is uncomfortable. I'm better off facing the discomfort right now and getting the long-term benefits. Does that answer the question, or was there a more specific thing related to procrastination? You had a question?
I really wanted to hear the why must formula, how it applies to procrastination.
Yeah. Okay, good. Any other questions about how this would apply to different issues?
So,
Yeah, someone has a question over there.
I've been recently looking into nonviolent communication. I don't know if you know.
Rosenberg?
Yeah, Rosenberg. It sounds actually very similar, maybe an aspect of it. I was wondering if you could elaborate or say what I'm believing is true or not.
Well, why don't you tell us one or two of the basic principles of nonviolent communication so we know what we're talking about? Jay, he has a follow-up response.
Well, basically, there's a quote I'm thinking of. He says, "Don't shed yourself."
Don't share yourself?
Should yourself.
Oh, don't should yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, if by should he means the way I defined it, it's an absolute, it leads to global evaluations, I'm no good, then definitely it's consonant with REBT, rational order behavior therapy. And remember, if you give up your shoulds, that doesn't mean you're left without motivation, without incentive, without goals, because you still have strong preferences. Just as analogously, if you give up the state, that doesn't mean you have people warring with each other all the time, but you have people doing things, acting spontaneously, forming groups, going after their own interests in the most efficient way possible. Phil, you had a question? Jane, over here.
Go ahead.
Okay.
What is that? Take the mic. Take the mic, Phil.
So, some of us think that we may end up in a world of the state, if the state goes completely nuts. And so if it comes to that, where really we have no choice, but all of us are going to die unless we fight them back, is anger then a motivating force in that, or is that an okay time to have anger, or is that still, we're still going to love the people we're killing if we have to do that?
Okay, that's a very good question, which is basically, is anger ever appropriate? Is anger ever useful? And my answer is no, it's never useful. Now, even anger at someone like Mao or Stalin or Hitler isn't useful, it just eats you up inside. Harry Emerson Fosdick said, anger is like burning down your house to get rid of a rat. You're just destroying yourself, and it also clouds your thinking, so it's harder to act efficiently and productively against the state if you're angry. Great role models are Murray Rothbard, Walter Block. They see humor in the state, although they're vicious criticizers of the state at the same time. So anger really doesn't help. Yes, Jay?
There's a question.
Oh, question.
So most of us come into the world, into a family not of our choosing, and often in abusive situations. And so as a child, we're in an involuntary captive situation in which we can learn thinking patterns that arguably help us to survive our captivity, but aren't helpful as adults. So would you say your approach is just that if you come from a particularly ugly history, you have the opportunity as an adult to learn a new language of talking to yourself, and how do you think empathy for what happened to your child self fits in?
Okay, that sounds like it's a two-part question, but the first part is our functional thinking patterns that we adopt as a child to get along, are those thinking patterns to disabuse ourselves as an adult? And the answer is it depends on what thinking patterns you're referring to. But children as well as adults tend to escalate their preferences into demands, musts, and shoulds. So if you have musts and shoulds as a child and you demand that your abusive parents not treat you abusively, then that's highly unrealistic, because the reality is they are treating you abusively. So the solution is to disabuse yourself of that and focus on your preference that they not treat you abusively and what you can do to change that. And that kind of thinking is also appropriate as an adult. So in terms of the psychopathological philosophies, they're not functional as children and not functional as adults. Now, I mainly work with adults because adults can think abstractly, they can think about their thinking and ask themselves if their thinking makes sense, whereas with children it's much more difficult. So I'm not saying it's easy to teach a child to get over their demanding, commanding philosophies, but it's the same thing that gets children emotionally disturbed, that gets adults emotionally disturbed. Does that answer the question? Sort of, okay. Janet, someone over here has a question?
When I hear dialogue that says like I should go to the gym, when I shouldn't say should, what might the ideal inner dialogue sound like?
Okay, the question is if you're saying I should go to the gym, and this is making you anxious about going to the gym, or it's getting you depressed about not going to the gym, or it's paralyzing you so you never get to the gym, then that is a problem. And so the solution is question that idea. Why do I absolutely have to? Why must I go to the gym? There are plenty of people enjoying life who never went to the gym in their entire history, so obviously it's not a must. The reason to go to the gym is because I presume I'll get advantages if I go to the gym, and I'll get disadvantages if I don't. So the way to deal with that is to see what's blocking you, and normally we could call this procrastination. You're procrastinating on going to the gym. So you ask yourself, why do I have to go to the gym? And is it the end of the world if I go and it's uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, I sweat and perspire and feel crummy while I'm at the gym? Would that be the end of the world? Would that be horrible? And the answer is no. I wouldn't like it, but in order to get the long-term benefits, it means facing the short-term pain. So it's getting rid of the must and shoulds, looking at the preferences, weighing advantages versus disadvantages, and acting on that rather than on must, which tend to block you and tend to magnify the disadvantages and minimize the advantages. Does that respond to that?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm wondering if you could maybe expand on how the principles that you're talking about with REBT interact with sort of those of us with religious modes of thinking, right? We often think in terms of moral imperatives and sin and following commandments, and so that's a sort of thinking that lends itself a lot to these musts and shoulds. And so how do we navigate that? And do you think that's part one? The second part of the question is, do you think there's a problem in the way that sort of religious discourse happens that encourages this sort of musting that you're talking about?
So the first question is, how does this approach address religious beliefs? And then, do religious beliefs exacerbate disturbed thinking? Is that pretty much it?
Yeah.
Well, the way this approach would address religious beliefs is that any philosophy of life, including REBT and libertarianism, are desiderata. This is the way it would be preferable to be. I prefer not to engage in musty thinking and upset myself, but there's no reason I must not, since I'm an imperfect human. That's the same with religion. You could have certain religious beliefs, and if you don't have them as musts and shoulds, I must not covet my neighbor's wife, and if I do, I'm a rotten lech. If you avoid the musts and you just say, I prefer not to, but if I do, I'm human, I'll try to do better in the future, then you can maintain religious beliefs not as absolute orthodoxy, but as preferences, and then you could work toward achieving your religious beliefs in a better way. Now, most orthodox, most traditional religions do encourage disturbance because they do confuse preferences into musts, and they talk about punishment. If you act badly, you're going to be punished, you're rotten, you're a sinner. So, and I think it was Jesus who said, hate the sin, not the sinner. But that's been lost in a lot of traditional religions, so it does tend to exacerbate this kind of thing. Yes?
Back to some of the more simple problems of human behavior. How do you deal with irrational fears of things that should not obviously most people we fear, spiders, lizards, things in the environment that some people can really be upset by. How do you deal with that?
Good question, and that's a common one. How does REBT deal with fears? And the answer is, again, the answer is always the same. The structure of all these problems is the same in terms of musts and shoulds. The structure of the solution is the same. Disputing your musts and shoulds, that's the lesson, but applying it to different situations, the content is different. So with fears, again, I prefer not to see a spider because I feel uncomfortable when I do, or if it bites me, I'm uncomfortable. And therefore, I must not be plagued with spiders. I can't stand the discomfort. It's the end of the world if I feel uncomfortable. So again, you question, challenge, dispute, and contradict the must. Okay, it's uncomfortable to have a spider crawling on you, but is there any reason why you must not be uncomfortable? Life consists of one discomfort after another. It always has and it always will. There's no reason why it should not, and there's no reason why you should escape from the discomfort of spiders. Now, normally, this brings in another problem, and that's called secondary disturbance. Often people with fears have a little anxiety or discomfort about whatever they're afraid of, riding in an elevator, going over a bridge, agoraphobia, acrophobia, whatever it happens to be. They have some discomfort. They say, I must not feel uncomfortable, so they get themselves a little anxious, but then they have a much larger must, secondary disturbance. I must not be anxious. I must not panic when I see a spider. I must not look like an idiot by running down the halls in a panic. So they have that secondary must, and often the solution is accepting the fact that they're human, they're allowed to be anxious about spiders. It's not the end of the world. It doesn't prove that they're a totally weak person, and they can fully accept themselves with fears. And if they accept themselves with the fear and don't put themselves down because of the anxiety, then they tend to do a lot better with the primary anxiety.
Michael and I have been friends since the early 70s, maybe the late 60s, I forget. And I've been his, he's been my therapist, and I've been his mentor in libertarianism. And sometimes what we do is I try to cure people using REBT, and he critiques me, and other times he tries to cure people with libertarianism, and I critique him, so we each learn more from each other. When I first started writing, I had this idea that my writing must be perfect, and if it wasn't, I couldn't write. And the eyes of history were looking at what I was writing and they were saying, "You're kidding, that's crap." And I couldn't write because I couldn't write perfectly. So I put this little sign on my wall and said, the next article or book I write will be perfect. This one I'll just write. And then I can write imperfectly, but better than not. I went to Albert Ellis first because I had problems with public speaking. I would get butterflies in my stomach, I would get tight throat, I would just feel horrible thinking that in 2 weeks I'm going to have to give a speech and it'll be awful if I do a bad job. And what Albert said was, imagine the worst possible thing that can happen. And my worst possible thing is I start the speech, everyone's cheering me, and there are 500 people in the room, and as I speak, one by one, they all leave. And after about 10 minutes, there's no one in the room, just me. And when I can honestly say, well, that wouldn't be awful, it would be unfortunate, I'll have to work on that speech again, then I could give speeches without this fear. But when I couldn't do it, I couldn't. I wanted to reiterate what Michael said about apples and depression and apply it to shoulds and musts, because there is a sense in which we libertarians say Obama shouldn't do whatever he's doing. And so if you look at it from the moral point of view, he shouldn't. But if you look at it from the REBT thing, he should. I mean, he's Obama, he has to. If he didn't, he wouldn't be Obama. So it's a very different kind of should, I think, that we're talking about. One last point, with regard to Obama, if I get angry at him, I incapacitate myself. It's sort of like burning down the house to get rid of that. So the aphorism I use is, don't get mad, get even. So then I can work it under fighting Obama or whoever the bad guy is. Whereas if I get angry, I'm apoplectic and I'm unable to do anything productive to undermine.
Well, I just wanted to add to that, Jay, and in terms of, there is a shortcut to inner peace and happiness, which I'd be amiss if I didn't tell you about. There was a study done with a group of students, and they were all given some money, $5, $10, $20, and they were divided into two groups. One group was told, spend this money on yourself, buy yourself gifts, whatever makes you happy, spend that money on. The other group was told, spend the money on someone else. Give other people gifts, give away the money, but don't spend it on yourself. The group that was given the instructions to spend the money on others reported being happier after the experiment than the group that spent the money on themselves. Now, I'll be passing a hat at the end of my talk. Feel free to donate generously. Was there another question?
There's a question here.
Yeah.
From an evolutionary point of view, why did humans develop this myth of the must? At some point, was it advantageous and it's no longer, or why did we develop this?
So the question is, of evolutionary psychology, why did this human tendency to escalate our preferences into must develop? And there are various theories about this. One more or less credible theory is that since a must is an overgeneralization, all or noneism, a million years ago, if you heard a rustle in the trees, it might have been functional to overgeneralize and say, that's a saber-toothed tiger ready to pounce on me, I better run. And if you were wrong, it was just the wind blowing through the leaves, you still survived, as you would have if you didn't overgeneralize. But if it was, in fact, a saber-toothed tiger, you saved your life. So it could be, in primitive days, overgeneralizing like this was functional, but these days in modern society, seeing the more subtle aspects of situations, the advantages versus disadvantages, which comes from thinking and preferences, rather than global evaluations, which comes from must, tends to work a lot better. Yes?
So we talked about some things like annoying drivers or getting fired from work, not wanting to work at the gym or spiders. What about things that are of greater impact in your life, like if your family was incinerated by a predator drone, saying that, well, anger is inappropriate or perhaps counterproductive. My question is, emotion is older than language, and emotion is, in my opinion, the driver of human action. People are not Spocks. They're feeling beings, and they tend to use language to try to rationalize how they want to feel and the feelings that they want to pursue. And so I think a lot of accomplishments in history are borne out by people who were burningly driven by various emotions, positive but often negative. It could be anger, it could be fear, it could be rage, it could be for any number of reasons. And I'm trying to understand the difference between being incapacitated personally, taking action because of an emotion versus using it as fuel, so to speak, to accomplish whatever ends you think is going to advance the cause.
Okay, that's a great question. And to shrink it down, I think the question is, aren't these negative emotions sometimes functional? They drive us to do good things, and in some situations, if we lose a loved one, it's appropriate to feel strong negative emotions. Is that pretty much it?
Yeah, it's not just inappropriate. It's just it seems like they can be actually useful. I'm just going back to think about my anger is never productive, for example. And I know a lot of my reason for being here results in years of reading. Why did I take the time and effort to read? Because I was angry at what I observed. if the anger instead made me just say, well, I need to be dispassionate about life because nothing's perfect. Sure, some people like to murder each other and sociopaths dictating my life, and that's life. And what's for lunch? It doesn't seem how society advances, because I think a very small number of individuals get obsessed, and I mean that in probably a good sense of the word. And even Jesus, who you referenced, was willing to be crucified because this feeling I think he would have is driven by his convictions. Not, these guys, nobody's perfect, and I guess I shouldn't expect that of myself either, so,
Okay, so some negative emotions give us passion, drive us to be productive, improve ourselves in society. So that's the problem here. Now, that's an important question, because REBT is not feel-good therapy. It's not a feel-good philosophy where no matter what happens, you feel good about it, or you're stoical about it in the stereotypical stoical sense that you don't have emotions, but rather it differentiates between appropriate and helpful negative emotions or positive emotions and inappropriate and unhelpful negative emotions. So passion, love, drive, determination, joy are all strong emotions which, if you get rid of the musts and shoulds, you are more likely to release. And extreme dislike and displeasure with situations are also appropriate and come from strong preferences, strong desires, strong values. So although I'm making the case it makes no sense to have gotten angry about Hitler, that doesn't stop us from strongly disliking what he did and calmly assassinating him. So I think what tends to drive people are strong preferences, and then when we escalate them into musts and shoulds and act when we're angry, also are confusing the anger with the strong passion. So the way to distinguish is have strong preferences, strong desires, which means it's highly disadvantageous. It's execrable when bad things happen, and we can be passionate about changing it without the anger part, without the must, without the global evaluations, without eating ourselves up inside. James, how are we doing on time?
Okay.
Well, okay.
5 more minutes.
In this approach, is there any room for a period of mourning after the loss of a loved one?
Okay, that's a similar question. Is there any room for a period of mourning? And the answer is yes, when a loved one dies, because you have a strong preference, a strong desire, a passionate goal that your loved one not die, so that leads to strong, appropriate negative emotions, grieving, mourning the loss, but not getting yourself depressed and convincing yourself your life is over because your loved one's life is over. That obviously makes no sense and doesn't help. And when I work with people who have depression and misery about losing a loved one, this tends to be the problem. They go from feeling from mourning and grieving to depression and hopelessness, and by parsing their thinking and helping them change their thinking, leads them to feel not good or numb about it, that doesn't make sense, but to grieve, mourn, cry, do other things that it's normal and appropriate and natural for humans to do when they lose a loved one, but not make demands that the universe be other than it is, and reality not be reality. Yes?
Hi. In the 1930s, dentists by the name of St. Price went around the world to some traditional cultures to confirm and deny the common assumption that these cultures were sometimes on verging on suicidal due to dental issues, they don't have dentistry, etc. So in confirming this, what he found was that in diets, in cultures where diets were traditional, and people were not influenced by Western diet, they didn't have sugar and various things that were really abusive. These people not only had perfect or nearly perfect teeth, but their health in general was considerably superior. And the general conception of the health of these traditional cultures was quite off base, that people were living long, healthy lives. One of the things they noticed was that in some of these cultures, the idea of mental ill health, depression, and that sort of thing were so unfamiliar in these cultures, they didn't have words for them, no word for depression. You know, what does that mean? They understood things like grieving if someone died, or sadness, or something, but no persistent thing that we have these days. So I'm wondering, in your treatment, is there an aspect of diet that you incorporate to your very interesting approach to mental health?
The question is diet and mental health, and the evidence seems mixed in terms of diet and mental health, and different people have different ideas about a healthy diet. It's not my area of expertise, but the point is, even if it's the case, let's say sugar leads to certain feelings of apathy, lethargy, those kinds of things, that's still an influence on your mental health, and then you have a choice. Are you going to make yourself miserable and hopeless and depressed about those unpleasant feelings, or are you going to realize that this is just a disadvantage, a limitation, and you can still move on with these limitations, although you may not be as efficient and as productive if you didn't have these limitations that may come from poor diet, but it doesn't mean you have to stop in your life and be totally paralyzed.
Okay. Thank you. No, I think we have run out.
Well, thank you for your time.
Waiting outside, so we can come back in about 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you.